Good evening, everyone. I'm glad to see so many of you here tonight, and I'm really excited to get into this topic. Now, to tell you the truth, this is my very first time doing something like this. So if anyone has any questions or comments about the material, make sure they're really simple and easy to understand, so that I don't get tripped up. I'll respond to them. I'm just kidding. So, Mark, can I have you lead the opening prayer for us, please? Thank you for that, Mark. Now, during our Wednesday evening classes for this quarter, we've gone into character studies of various figures from the Bible. This book is really nice because it not only tells us how we should live our lives according to God, it also gives us countless examples of people whose lives serve as examples for us. Today I'm going to talk about two more obscure figures who only feature in three chapters out of the whole Bible. So if you'd like to turn there, head right over to Acts chapter 24. Both of these Bible characters, Felix and Festus, were Roman-instituted governors of Judea, and they have enough similarities that I think it made sense to just lump them all together into one class. I do hope we get to discuss both, but to tell you the truth, I have absolutely no idea how long this will take. But even if we only get the chance to discuss just one of them, I'll still consider today a success. Before we get started with Acts, though, I will read a short passage from Matthew chapter 7, verses 13 to 14. You don't have to turn there, just a couple of verses. Enter by the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the way is easy that leads to destruction, and those who enter by it are many. For the gate is narrow and the way is hard that leads to life, and those who find it are few. So throughout this whole class, I want you to keep those words in mind, because the wide gate, the gate that leads to destruction, is going to feature very heavily in the study. So let's return to Acts 24. I don't want to get too bogged down explaining the context here, but I will still need to set the scene for you all, because Acts 24 and 25 are very, very closely tied to the previous chapters. Because at this point in the Acts narrative, the Apostle Paul is on trial. In the previous chapters, the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem had accused Paul of teaching contrary to the law of Moses and of bringing a Greek person, a Gentile, into the holy temple. Of course, these charges are complete nonsense. Paul, before his conversion, was actually a very zealous Jew who knew the law front and back, as he describes in chapter 22. And there's really nothing we can find throughout his entire spiritual journey in Acts that even comes close to outright opposing the Mosaic law. As for the charge about bringing a Greek person into the temple, this one's kind of funny. So basically in chapter 21, the Jews noticed that an Ephesian had accompanied Paul throughout the city of Jerusalem, and they just assumed without evidence that Paul had brought him into the temple as well. But whatever the case, the shouts of the Jewish leaders attracted the attention of the Romans, who found out in Acts 23 that Paul was in fact a born Roman citizen, which allowed him substantial legal protection. They couldn't just punish him without a trial or leave him to the mob to kill. And so then we move over from Jerusalem to Caesarea, where Paul and the Jewish leaders finally present their case before the Roman governor of Judea, Antonius Felix. Paul isn't dealing with the Jewish council anymore. He's facing a higher up in the Roman Empire. Can I have someone read for me verses 1 to 3 of chapter 24? Thank you very much. So, it seems that the Jewish leaders have gone to the trouble of hiring a lawyer to present their case, and this is him kicking off his opening statement. Something that really sticks out about that statement is just how flattering the lawyer is to Felix. Of course, this is a trial, and Felix is essentially the judge, so I guess a certain degree of flattery is expected. But I mentioned this opening statement from Tertullus only because of just how ironic the flattery is, considering what we know about Felix from extra-biblical evidence. Far from being a peaceful ruler, as Tertullus suggests, Felix was brutal. So much of the evidence here comes from the writings of ancient historians, and they aren't too fond of him. Roman historian Tacitus writes that Felix's reign over Judea was very violent. Roman relations with the Jews had gotten much worse since he became governor, and at one point he even hired robbers to assassinate the Jewish high priest of the time, the high priest of Israel at the time, Jonathan. In short, we're not looking at a benevolent ruler here. So keep that in mind as we read this next passage, and hopefully it will make some things a little bit clearer. And so it feels very wrong to say this, but we're actually going to skip over the whole trial portion of Acts 24 and pick up our reading after it's over. I will just give you the Cliff's Notes version of Paul's trial. The main things that you need to know are that the Jews presented their case against Paul, which again, as I mentioned before, was complete nonsense. And that Paul then gave us much more detailed and much more accurate and much more convincing defense. Basically, it's pretty clear who's in the right. So can I have someone read from verse 22 all the way to the end of the chapter?
But Felix, having a rather accurate knowledge of the way, put them off, saying, "When Lysias the tribune comes down, I will decide your case." Then he gave orders to the centurion that he should be kept in custody, but have some liberty, and that none of his friends should be prevented from attending to his needs. After some days, Felix came with his wife Drusilla, who was Jewish, and he sent for Paul and heard him speak about faith in Christ Jesus. And as he reasoned about righteousness and self-control and the coming judgment, Felix was alarmed and said, "Go away for the present. When I get an opportunity, I will summon you." At the same time, he hoped that money would be given him by Paul, so he sent for him often and conversed with him. When 2 years had elapsed, Felix was succeeded by Festus, and desiring to do the Jews a favor, Felix left Paul in prison.
So there is really a lot to unpack in just this one little passage about Felix. And I would love to do the unpacking myself, but I would assume you all are probably perhaps tired of my voice at this point. No worries, I am too. So I'd like to open this one up to you all. Does anyone want to share their general impressions of Felix based on what we just read? Any things that stick out?
To me, it sounds like he showed an interest in Paul, but really, it looks like all he was interested in was getting some money from Paul, maybe hoping maybe he would release him, or maybe he would do whatever, but he really just wanted to get money from Paul whenever he would call him in to see him.
Yeah, exactly. So let's actually talk about this for a second. He basically strung Paul along, had all these conversations with him for about 2 whole years, as the text says, and his end goal in all of this was basically a bribe. He didn't really care about the gospel. He did care about what he would get from it in return. So any other things that stick out here?
It seems like he was afraid to learn about the things he was doing wrong. In verse 25, where it says he reasoned about righteousness and self-control and the coming judgment, Felix is like, "Oh, go away. I don't want to listen to this." So he doesn't want to listen. He doesn't care about the truth. He just wants to hear he's got like itching ears. He just wants to hear what he wants to hear.
Yeah, exactly. So he's wanting to take in the parts about the gospel that he likes to hear, and he's ignoring the parts that basically push his own sins into the limelight. So the extra biblical evidence of Felix actually fleshes this out a lot more. And I don't think it's a coincidence that Luke, the writer of Acts, decided to mention his wife by name. But basically, the story about how they got married. So basically, Drusilla, his wife was a practicing Jew, and basically Felix convinced her to divorce her previous husband so that he would end up marrying her. And then I think that might be why Felix was so alarmed when Paul brought up righteousness and self-control and the coming judgment in front of both him and his wife. There is one more thing that I noticed throughout all of this. It's at the very end of it, where Felix says that, it's at verse 27 where it says, "Desiring to do the Jews a favor, Felix left Paul in prison." So Felix basically wanted to do a favor to the Jews rather than do the right thing, that is, accept the gospel and free a clearly innocent prisoner. So And again, as I mentioned before, Felix wasn't all that popular with the Jews, so this was probably his way of currying some support as he was on his way out. He didn't want to end his relations with the Jews on a bad note. So I will note that there's a general theme throughout Felix's interactions with Paul, and by extension, his interactions with the gospel message. Felix is purely looking out for his own interests. What is the easiest way that I can get through this? And so I believe that now is a good time to bring up the passage that I read at the beginning of this class about the wide gate, the easy road that leads to destruction. I believe Jesus' description of the wide gate perfectly applies to Felix's story in the Bible. There are many different ways that one can take this gate, and Felix, in my view, gives 3 excellent examples of them. As I go through them, ponder this question. Do you see these examples manifesting themselves within your own lives? I know I certainly do. So one way that we might take the easy way is by brushing off the gospel whenever it brings our sins to the limelight, as Bryce was mentioning. So recall verse 25. As he reasoned about righteousness and self-control in the coming judgment, Felix was alarmed and said, "Go away for the present. When I get an opportunity, I will summon you." So, as I said before, Felix seemed to be just fine with the gospel to a point. But when Paul spoke about righteousness, self-control, and the judgment, Felix was alarmed, surely because this reminded him of his own sin. I'm heavily inclined to think back to 2 Samuel 12, where King David was confronted by the prophet Nathan for his sin of sending Uriah to his death on the battlefield. And so it comes to mind, what was David's reaction there? Well, he was immediately filled with shame, and his reply was simply this: "I have sinned against the Lord." Simply that. He confessed. He owned up to it. So, how exactly then does Felix's reaction stack up to David's? "Go away, I'll talk to you later," or something. See, it's the wide gate to David's narrow gate. You see, it's a whole lot easier to cover your ears and pretend the problem doesn't exist than to stand up straight, acknowledge you were in the wrong, and strive to do better. It's so easy to ignore the parts of the Bible that make us uncomfortable, and so hard to acknowledge the parts that directly call us out. Another way that Felix tried to take the easy road was by pursuing the gospel with the expectation that he would be getting something back from it. How does this benefit me? Let me read verse 26 again. At the same time he, Felix, hoped that money would be given him by Paul, so he sent for him often and conversed with him. So it seems that after Felix brushed Paul off, he still continued to chat with him, and I think it's reasonable to assume that Paul continued to speak about the gospel with the governor. But I don't think it's likely that Felix was actually genuinely interested in the gospel's teachings. He just wanted the bribe. And that is another example here of taking the wide road. Because when you're only looking for what you can get in return for the gospel, then you're not really seeking the gospel in good faith, are you? And at best, you're viewing Christianity as this cold business transaction where you give something and expect to get something in return. And at worst, you're exploiting it for your own gain, which is what Felix was trying to do here. The third path to the wide gate that I have up on the slide here is simply this. What if there's another way, different from the gospel, that just looks easier for me to do? Verse 27, when 2 years had elapsed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus, and desiring to do the Jews a favor, Felix left Paul in prison. So given what Felix had heard about Paul these past 2 years, that while Paul was in custody, it should have been obvious that the apostle was completely innocent of every single charge the Jews laid up against him. And in addition, Paul spoke a message that was true. If it wasn't true, why would Felix have been alarmed when Paul spoke about righteousness? But even despite all of that, Felix still left him in prison as a favor to the Jews. And it was the easy thing to do, of course. If Felix had done the right thing and let Paul go, the Jewish leaders would have been furious. And let's not forget from our extra-biblical evidence that Felix was already in hot water for having the high priest killed. So this would only have added to his general unpopularity. Now, I do want to treat this subject somewhat delicately. It's easy to dunk on Felix for the wrong choices he made here, but let's not forget that the alternatives, the right choices, were very difficult to do. Confessing to one's own sin is a tough thing to, and doing something that upsets everyone else, like freeing Paul from custody, is tough. In a moment, I'd like to switch gears and move on to the next Roman governor, Festus. But before that, I really want to open up the floor and talk about what I have up here on the slide. We've just discussed 3 methods by which Felix chose the wide gate rather than the narrow gate. He chose to ignore the gospel's teaching when it made him uncomfortable. He chose to seek out the gospel only for what it could give to him, rather than what he could give. And that he chose the wrong path because it just looked much easier for him. I invite you all to think of any real-life examples of someone making similar choices, or even other examples from the Bible of people making these same choices, these same instances of taking the wide gate.
I was just thinking about, in the first one, how, if he's coming in and telling him about Jesus, that's a pretty incredible story. This man came, he did all these miracles, then he died and he came back to life, and now he's willing to forgive you and let you have this great life. That's a wonderful story. And that grace is incredible. I think everybody responds well to that. But it's always the case that when you continue to learn more and you find out, well, I have to sacrifice myself, and now I'm going to live for someone else, and I'm going to be a slave to him, and I'm going to try to walk in a godly way, that's where most of us trip up and have trouble with it. So I think it's very relatable.
Yeah, exactly. One thing that I've really thought about with regards to the second, with one of these instances, is where some people, and this is opening sort of a can of worms, but when we accept the gospel only out of fear of going to hell, that's a tough one to think about, but at the same time, if we're only choosing to live a godly life, only because we're so scared of hell, of eternal punishment, then are we really pursuing the gospel in good faith? We're only looking for something that would benefit ourselves, not going to hell, going to heaven, and that's something that's always been on my mind the past few years and so, and it's definitely a thought that I've had myself, and I just think that it's a really interesting example of choosing the wide road rather than the easy road, rather than the narrow road. Will you accept the gospel only because you're looking for the privileges, the benefits of taking the gospel, or are you willing to accept the gospel because of what you feel you can give to God?
I think it changes over time. It's not always the same answer. Maybe day to day it changes, or maybe years or chapters of your life.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes you're motivated by fear. Sometimes you're motivated by love. Sometimes there's just different drivers in why you live your life for the gospel. I don't think it stays the same.
Yeah.
It'll evolve.
And Proverbs tells us that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. So it's not that there's anything wrong with that fear, but it's a healthy fear. We should fear the Lord, but that's the beginning. And then that develops into more love for the Lord and wanting to serve and wanting to be pleasing to Him. But there is, I think, an aspect of fear of the Lord that we should have.
So I think I really should have had that proverb over here, because that so beautifully illustrates the point here. Let's see, so does anyone else have any particular examples or?
Yeah, sorry, this might be a little bit long-winded, but we just went over this in our Tuesday Bible study, me and John do with high school boys, and I presented the option to them when we read through this story. I was like, so these are the choices that Felix has here.
That's a really good point. It talks. There's an interesting quote. I think it's something about in times of injustice, when you remain silent, you inevitably take a side with the oppressor. And that quote, what you just said, Luke, kind of reminded me of that quote. It's very easy to just edge away from the situation and pretend, oh, this doesn't involve me. I can't do anything about this. And in fact, we will see a little bit of this with Festus when we get to talking about him. But yeah, not taking a decision about the gospel is inherently taking a decision about the gospel, just because of what the gospel is. Like it's a path to salvation, and you have to take it, or you don't take it. There's no real in between here. So, I think we can start shifting gears a bit here, and then turn to our second character for this discussion, Porcius Festus. He is appointed by the emperor Nero to succeed Felix as governor, and I find that our discussion of the Wide Gate certainly applies to him as well. There are very few extra biblical accounts of Festus, but from what little we know, it seems that he was very heavily involved in cleaning up the messes that Felix left behind. He sought to repair relations with the Jews and generally just ease tensions all around. Certainly seems like a more responsible leader than his predecessor, but that's really all we can say about him. But what we do know about him still does provide some context for this next passage. We are going to start now in Acts 25. It's a longish reading, but can I get someone to read the first 12 verses?
Now 3 days after Festus had arrived in the province, he went up to Jerusalem from Caesarea. And the chief priests and the principal men of the Jews laid out their case against Paul, and they urged him, asking as a favor against Paul that he summon him to Jerusalem, because they were planning an ambush to kill him on the way. Festus replied that Paul was being kept in Caesarea, and that he himself intended to go there shortly. So, said he, let the men of authority among you go down with me, and if there is anything wrong about the man, let them bring charges against him. After he stayed among them not more than 8 or 10 days, he went down to Caesarea. And on the next day he took his seat on the tribunal and ordered Paul to be brought. When he had arrived, Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him, bringing many and serious charges against him that they could not prove. Paul argued in his defense, neither against the law of the Jews, nor against the temple, nor against Caesar have I committed any offense. But Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, said to Paul, do you wish to go to Jerusalem and there be tried on these charges before me? But Paul said, I am standing before Caesar's tribunal, where I ought to be tried. To the Jews I have done no wrong, as you yourself know very well. If then I am a wrongdoer and have committed anything for which I deserve to die, I do not seek to escape death. But if there is nothing to their charges against me, no one can give me up to them. I appeal to Caesar. Then Festus, when he had conferred with his council, answered, to Caesar you have appealed, to Caesar you shall go.
So, a lot's happening in this passage, but basically, Paul is currently in prison over in Caesarea, thanks Felix. And as one of his first acts as governor, Festus decides to reopen Paul's case. The Jewish leaders want Paul to be tried in Jerusalem so that they can assassinate him on the way and finally be rid of him. But Festus presumably wants to make the Jews happy. So, as a favor to them, he basically asks Paul, hey, Jerusalem seems like a really good place to have this trial. What do you say? And then Paul, of course, sees right through this ruse, and in verse 10 tells Festus that the governor knows Paul is innocent and that he has done no wrong to the Jews. Then Paul appeals directly to Caesar, as is his right as a Roman citizen, and Festus can't really do anything about it beyond that point. So, to be clear, Festus knows that Paul is innocent, so the right thing would be, again, to let him go. But imagine you're Festus. The guy who was governor before you really screwed things up and made the Jewish leaders mad. There's another guy who's been in prison for a couple of years now, and the Jews want this guy dead. even though he's completely innocent of any wrongdoing. You want to keep the peace in Judea, so it really would be easier to just send this guy off to Jerusalem and let the Jews kill him. That should calm things down, maybe. But if you let this guy run, if you let this guy walk free, even though it absolutely is the right thing to do, the Jews are only going to get angrier, which will lead to riots, rebellion. Overall, not a good situation. But taking the narrow gate was never supposed to be an easy thing, and sometimes taking the narrow gate will make other people angry. Festus opted for the wide gate, keeping the peace instead of doing the right thing. It calls to mind Matthew chapter 10 and verse 34, where Jesus says that he's not come to bring peace, but a sword. Following the path of Jesus is something that is going to make people angry. And this is something that I myself struggle with, because I'm the sort of person who tries to keep the peace at all costs. And sometimes that may involve, choosing not to do the right thing, even if I can tell that's going to upset some people. But sometimes you do have to take a stand, even when that stand will upset a lot of people, because it's as Luke was saying earlier, not taking a stance is taking a stance with regard to the gospel. I am just dying to open the floor here. Give me just a few more moments. I'm going to give one more example of Festus taking the wide gate, and then we'll open up discussion for both of these examples at once. That'll be the last thing on the agenda for today. And I would like one more reader to pick up from where we left off and read verses 13 to 22 of chapter 25.
Now when some days had passed, Agrippa the king and Bernice arrived at Caesarea to greet Festus. And as they stayed there many days, Festus laid Paul's case before the king, saying, "There is a man left prisoner by Felix. And when I was in Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews laid out their case against him, asking for a sentence of condemnation against him. I answered them that it was not the custom of the Romans to give up anyone before the accused met the accusers face to face, and had an opportunity to make his defense concerning the charge laid against him. So when they came together here, I made no delay, but on the next day took my seat at the tribunal and ordered the man to be brought. When the accusers stood up, they brought no charge in his case of such evils as I supposed. Rather, they had certain points of dispute with him about their own religion and about a certain Jesus who was dead, but whom Paul asserted to be alive. Being at a loss how to investigate these questions, I asked whether he wanted to go to Jerusalem to be tried there regarding them. But when Paul had appealed to be kept in custody for the decision of the emperor, I ordered him to be held until I could send him to Caesar. Then Agrippa said to Festus, "I would like to hear the man myself." "Tomorrow," said he, "you will hear him."
Okay, so in this passage here, Festus is basically looking for a second opinion from King Herod Agrippa here before he sends Paul off to the emperor. Do you get the impression that the governor is being a little flattering to himself in his description of the situation? He certainly makes it seem like he did the very best he could with Paul's case, and that he was at a loss how to investigate these questions. You see, after having read the previous passage, this just doesn't ring true to me. And especially given Paul's observations in the previous passage, that Festus knew Paul was innocent. Now, it's possible I might be looking too deeply into this matter, but it does look like Festus is trying to shift responsibility for Paul's case away from himself, while asserting that he did everything he possibly could. But that's just not true, and it's just another example of the governor trying to take the path of least resistance. Passing responsibility is far easier than accepting it, especially when we start to talk about doing what God wants from us. Maybe we'll only put 60% of the work into living a Christian life, and we'll blame the other 40% on things supposedly well outside our control. Well, I was busy completing this assignment, or I'm just not physically capable of doing this. And I'd like to think of Moses in Exodus chapter 4, where he's making his excuses for not being able to perform the task that God had laid before him. That is the task to go to Pharaoh and speak on God's behalf. Remember, his excuses included things like, "I am slow of speech and tongue. They will never believe me." And my favorite, "Lord, please send someone else." And So Festus here only gave a half-hearted attempt at securing justice for Paul, but he made it appear as if that was the very best he could possibly have done. As Christians, we can't serve God half-heartedly and then pretend like we did our best. Between a full effort and a 60% effort, which will we describe as the narrow gate and which one will we describe as the wide, easy gate? You see, we have to fully commit to the narrow gate. It's our responsibility. That's difficult. So, I have just described two ways that Festus, just like Felix, opted for the wide, easy gate over the narrow, difficult gate. He chose to keep the peace over doing the right thing, and he chose to pass responsibility instead of assuming it. So, just like what we did last time with Felix, do any similar examples come from your own lives, or in the Bible, come to mind? Jake?
I think both of these kind of line up with the mindset of the day today. Either passing the buck and giving it to someone else or just keeping the peace. I think both of those are the motto of either the relativist or the postmodernist view, which is we're all on the same road to heaven, or we're all on different paths to the same endpoint. And I think both of those are A, an attempt to just say everyone's okay, everyone's doing what's right in their own eyes, and then B, I don't want to take the responsibility of finding out through the scripture what is the one true way. And we read in John chapter 14, Jesus says that I am the way, and the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. And then we also read throughout the New Testament that to show love to Jesus is to follow what he has set apart in his word. And so I think both of these points just go to directly show that the mindset of the day, this postmodernist world that we live in, that this is not correct. This is not the way that the Lord has intended things. And then we also like to say that it's ugly to stand on the truth. It's ugly to be confident in our salvation. And a man that I was talking to was in a debate, and someone said to him, "Isn't it a little cocky to say that you are the first century church?" And he said, "Well, isn't it a little bit troubling to say that you're not?" And I think that that's the attitude and the motto that we need to have going into the world today.
That's a really, really good point. See, think about it though, like, the postmodernist view that, like, oh, everyone's going to heaven. Think about how easy that is to believe. Like, everyone's going to heaven. That just removes so much responsibility from ourselves, and it's so easy to fall into that. But again, we need to have not only the willingness to accept the truth, which might seem harder for us to accept. We also need the humility to accept that there's just one way, one truth, one life through Jesus, and that's the only way salvation can occur. Nick.
I can't help but think of this a little bit from the legal perspective. The fact that Paul is on trial here, and these characters that we are talking about are consistently the judge in these cases. And I think about U.S. history and the fact that our courts have gotten it wrong on numerous occasions. So much so that we've put innocent men to death in courts across the U.S. Our justice system gets it wrong sometimes. And these characters here that don't seem to like Paul, that would like to just appease the Jews, you think if there was credible evidence against him, they could just rule against Paul and put him to death. I think it's notable to say, he points out multiple times, you as the judge, you know that I am innocent. He says, let's see, in verse 10?
Verse 10.
The Jews I have done no wrong, as you yourself know very well. Like that's kind of awesome to me, is that Paul is traveling the world and preaching, and even as he's standing before a judge who's adverse to him, he can look that judge in the eye and go, you know that I have done no wrong. It kind of reminds me of the qualifications of an elder. And I know that Paul is obviously not an elder, but 1 Timothy 3 verse 7 says, moreover, he, an elder, must be well thought of by outsiders, so that he may not fall into disgrace, into a snare of the devil. And if Paul had been, living his life in an improper way, this would have been the moment when the Jews would have found something, and the judge would have ruled against him. But he lived his life in a way that even these judges who wanted to put him to death, even these people that were arguing against him, could find nothing wrong in him.
Yeah, that's really powerful to think about. Like I know this this study we've been going through Felix and Festus, but we've also been learning quite a lot about Paul himself and how he's able to withstand all of these different charges, completely baseless charges. And through all of this, he walks out, and there's absolutely nothing they can pin on him, even though the literal judges are working against them, basically.
I was thinking about the passing responsibility. We've been doing that since the Garden of Eden with, the woman you gave me. But I think one of my favorite ones that I read this last week was when Ahab wanted to blame Elijah for the 3 years of drought, and he shows up on the scene in 1 Kings 18, and he says, "Is that you, O troubler of Israel?" And he's speaking for God, and he says back to him, "I've not troubled Israel, but you and your father's house have, in that you have forsaken the commandments of the Lord and have followed the Baals." And I just think, he just got called on a carpet right there. God knows we cannot pass responsibility for any of our wrongdoing on someone else. So that's kind of what came to my mind there with Festus.
Yeah. And another biblical example that comes to mind, it doesn't have anything to do with admitting responsibility for past sins, but more so it's trying to shove away the responsibility when it comes to accomplishing a task that's before you. I talked about Moses before, but there's also Jonah, at the beginning where I don't think he even said anything. He just ran away silently, trying to shirk the responsibility that was laid upon his shoulders. So that's another biblical example I just thought of right here. Stacy?
Felix and Festus both had an apostle standing there before them, teaching them about Jesus. Neither one of them converted. It's kind of interesting to see how somebody can be taught well by somebody so knowingly and not be converted. It's comforting to us to know that happens sometimes. And it reminds me of the parable of the sower. Jesus told us sometimes some people can be like that hard dirt of the path, and the gospel will fall on them, and it can't get through. It can't take root because there's something that's causing them to just resist, be hard, and you're not going to be able to win that person over to Christ.
Thinking about these two characters, and then about Pilate from last week, it's just 3 politicians in a row, and the politicians in these instances are just trying to please as many constituents as they can. And that made me think a little bit, there's a little bit of a politician in all of us, in the sense of we all have some kind of innate desire to say the right thing, to please the people that we're around, to mold ourselves to the situation that we're in. And I think, as I'm thinking about what this means for me, I see that it's easy sometimes to downplay my Christianity or to say this is the side that I'm on, and to be clear about that and to know that it will turn off maybe the majority of people. Of course, we get different pictures than politicians. I was thinking of Ephesians 6 where we're soldiers in the army. And if you're a soldier instead of a politician, there's no question what side you're on, what your objective is, where you're going, and that's more of the picture of what we're supposed to be, and just it's clear what our objective is.
Oh yeah, and with Pilate, I was just thinking of a connection. And yeah, we actually talked about Pilate last week. This was completely coincidental that this one came right after the Pilate one, but I really think it makes thematic sense because there's an instance at the end of the verse does not come to mind, but right after Pilate has given Jesus away, he basically tries to get the responsibility away from himself by saying, "My hands are clean. You guys are the ones crucifying him. I didn't do anything." Like, in fact, the whole section where Pilate is in the Gospels, it's all just him trying to keep the peace, as I mentioned before, and basically lift the responsibility off his shoulders and move it on to someone else. He's not going to be responsible for this guy being crucified. So yeah, I think the Pilate connection is a really good one. We have a couple minutes here, so I'm going to go a little off script here because I didn't think I horribly mistimed this and thought that we'd be done a little bit later than now. But I have one more passage with Festus, where it's over in Acts 26, and the whole context here is Paul is making his defense before King Agrippa, and basically he's pleading his case before him, and he's talking about his whole life, basically his whole life story, and right at the very end, which is verses 22 to 23. "To this day I have had the help that comes from God, and so I stand here testifying both to small and great, saying nothing but what the prophets and Moses said would come to pass, that the Christ should suffer, and that by being the first to rise from the dead, he would proclaim light both to our people and to the Gentiles." In verse 24, "As he was saying these things in his defense, Festus said with a loud voice, 'Paul, you are out of your mind. Your great learning is driving you out of your mind.'" That reaction just really strikes me, because this whole time Festus is kind of avoiding conflict and trying to keep the peace. But this time, it seems that he's kind of reached the end here. Like, he doesn't want to deal with Paul anymore. So he's just saying, "Paul, you're out of your mind." It just really feels like this last exasperated. And again, that might be another instance of taking the easy road. It's easier to just wave away the gospel than to engage with it intelligently. So anyway, that's the last little comment I had about this. Does anyone have any final? Yeah.
I think it's interesting on that spot too. I mean, you think of Festus as like, "Paul, what are you doing? You could if you just say the right things, you can walk out." But Paul's standing up for Christ is his whole purpose of being, and it's in Festus's mind, that's just completely upside down for what he should do, right? So it all should be about self-preservation and what can I get out of it for myself. And he sees Paul's statement is just I don't understand you, Paul.
Yeah, that contrast with Paul, it really just gets to the heart of what this is all about. Paul is, throughout these whole chapters, he's taking the narrow gate. He's engaging with these Jews, even though they're out to get him at every turn. He was in prison for 2 whole years, and then even after he got out of prison, the Jews were still mad at him, and they wanted to assassinate him while he would go on the road to Jerusalem. So it's really interesting to contrast Felix and Festus with Paul the apostle, and how they picked their paths. Felix and Festus took the wide gate, the easy road that leads to destruction, and Paul took the narrow gate, the difficult one that ultimately leads to life. I think that's a really good note to end on. So thank you all for your comments. This is a very interesting session, and I think I learned a lot as well.